The hum of the airport was deafening, a constant buzz of voices, wheels rolling, and distant announcements that never quite made sense. Among the sea of travelers, one woman stood still, her eyes scanning the overhead flight boards as if they might change at any moment. Her name was Maya. She had always been a woman who found herself on the edge of something, the edge of too little, the edge of too much. And now she stood on the edge of a flight she hadn't paid for. The ticket counter was closed. The agent had disappeared behind a glass door. Maya's heart raced as she walked past the rows of perfectly dressed passengers. They weren't her people. Their skin was too light, their eyes too free from worry. Her eyes were different, haunted by the constant weight of survival, the kind of survival that never seemed to get easier. She didn't have the money for a ticket. She didn't have the luxury of time, but she had to get on that plane. She needed to be somewhere else, somewhere far from the desperate life she had been living. The thought of another night in a dingy apartment, the smell of fast food still lingering in her clothes, was too much to bear. A loud, boisterous voice echoed through the terminal, pulling her from her thoughts. "Next in line." The agent at the counter waved her forward, but Maya hesitated. She had no ticket, no proof that she should be on that plane, but the urgency in her chest flared up, overwhelming her doubt. She wasn't invisible, not entirely. There were eyes on her, and those eyes, some of them full of disdain, others filled with curiosity, made her feel like a stray dog in a place where only the privileged belonged. The moment her feet crossed the threshold of the gate, her pulse quickened. She could feel the gaze of the security guard, his eyes narrowing as she walked past the line. She didn't stop. She couldn't. If she hesitated, everything would fall apart. "Excuse me, miss," a voice barked from behind her. The sound of footsteps chasing after her grew louder, and she turned to face the airport staff, a woman dressed in a navy blue uniform, her lips tight, her eyes already accusing. "You can't go through without a boarding pass." Maya's throat tightened. There was no way out. She needed this. She needed it more than she had ever needed anything in her life. I'm just trying to get to the gate," she stammered, her voice too weak, too uncertain. But it wasn't enough. It never was. "Step aside, now," the agent demanded, her hand snapping out to grab Maya's arm. The jarring touch made Maya flinch. Her skin burned where the agent's fingers had gripped her, a harsh reminder that she wasn't supposed to be here. Never was, never would be. The agent's gaze was cold, and the quiet murmurs from the passengers around them didn't help. Maya knew what they were thinking. "Another one," they would whisper when she was out of earshot. "A problem. Please, I just need to get on that flight. Please," Maya pleaded, desperation creeping into her voice. The woman's expression didn't soften. "I'll need to check your ID. Do you have a ticket?" Maya's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't tell her the truth. She couldn't tell anyone that she didn't belong, that she didn't even know how she had gotten this far. The agent's eyes were narrowing now. The others were watching, and in the silent scrutiny of their judgment, Maya could feel her throat tightening, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Every eye, every whisper felt like a weight on her chest. It wasn't just the ticket she didn't have. It was the place she had no right to occupy. The agent's fingers were hovering over a keypad, poised to send her away in an instant. But Maya, she wasn't going to let that happen. Not now. Not when she was so close. Without thinking, Maya grabbed the closest empty boarding pass, one left carelessly discarded on the seat by an anxious traveler, and shoved it into the agent's face. "Here," she said, her voice suddenly firm, her heart pounding in her ears. "It's my ticket." For a long moment, the agent stared at her, the tension between them thickening with every passing second. The room seemed to go still, and then, slowly, the agent reached for the pass. Her fingers brushed against Maya's, cold and indifferent. "Let's see if you can fly," she muttered, barely audible above the sound of the airport. The moment she swiped the card, the metallic beep echoed, and Maya's pulse raced. Had it worked? Had she just lied her way onto this plane? But then the words flashed up on the screen. "Accepted." Maya blinked. For a split second, her breath caught in her chest. But she had no time to think. The gate opened, and the air around her felt like a suffocating fog. As she stepped onto the plane, she could almost hear the whispers following her, feel the eyes burning into her back. They didn't know her. They didn't understand what it took to get to this moment, to have nothing but still take it all. And so, she sat down, her knees trembling, hands cold, heart thudding in her chest. The flight had just begun, but it already felt like she was flying towards something darker, something deeper. She didn't know yet that this plane ride would take her somewhere far beyond the boundaries of her life, somewhere where survival would cost more than a plane ticket. But she would find out soon enough. Maya sat in her seat, gripping the armrests as if they were the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. The flight attendants moved down the aisle, their faces cold, impersonal, as if they had long ago learned to mask any empathy they might have had. She could feel their eyes occasionally darting to her, measuring her, as if trying to decide if she belonged. It was always like this, always the same, wherever she went. The invisible line she had crossed by just existing in this world felt like it was being drawn clearer and clearer every day. She glanced to her left. A well-dressed man in his 40s was sitting there, his eyes hidden behind dark, expensive sunglasses. He was talking on the phone, his voice low, but his words dripping with the kind of arrogance she had grown to recognize, a kind of superiority she couldn't help but despise. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, hoping that no one would ask her questions, that no one would notice her. Her presence here didn't make sense to them, to the people who traveled like this, who had money and status, who didn't have to sneak through life. Suddenly the plane jolted, a violent shake that sent a sharp jolt of panic through her body. The seatbelt sign flickered on, and an announcement echoed over the intercom, telling everyone to remain seated. Maya's stomach flipped, not from the turbulence, but from the knot of dread that had been tightening inside her since the moment she had boarded. She knew what would come next. It was inevitable. The well-dressed man next to her, still engrossed in his phone conversation, didn't even flinch. But Maya felt it. The eyes of the passengers were no longer just casual glances. They were deliberate, assessing her. The discomfort in her bones grew as the air around her thickened with judgment. And then, it happened. A voice, sharp and dismissive, cut through the stillness of the cabin. "Excuse me," the voice said. A woman's voice, too polished, too practiced in its tone. Maya turned to see a flight attendant standing at the end of her row, her arms crossed over her chest, her gaze cold. "You can't sit there." Maya's throat tightened as she blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. "What?" The woman stepped closer, her lips barely concealing a sneer. "You don't belong in first class. Move to the back of the plane." Maya's heart skipped a beat. There it was, the judgment, the reminder of her place. I don't think She stammered, trying to find her words, trying to push back against the storm of emotions that threatened to flood her. But the flight attendant wasn't listening. The woman's gaze had already shifted to the aisle, as if Maya's very presence in the seat was something she could just erase. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," the flight attendant said, her voice dripping with contempt. "You don't belong here." The man next to her, still oblivious to the scene, finally noticed the tension. He lowered his phone, his eyes flickering over Maya, then quickly looking away, as if not wanting to acknowledge the uncomfortable reality unfolding. But Maya couldn't ignore it. The harsh truth hit her like a slap to the face. Her skin, the color of the earth that had carried centuries of pain and struggle, was the reason she didn't belong here. The same skin that marked her as an outsider, an intruder, a person who had no right to share space with the people around her. It was the same skin that had made her invisible in every system of power, every room of influence, every door that had remained closed in her face. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tell them everything, to remind them that her blood had bought this seat, even if they didn't know it, but no words came. Instead, her hand instinctively tightened around the armrest as she tried to compose herself. "Move!" the flight attendant repeated, her eyes narrowing with increasing irritation. For a moment, Maya froze, the sting of humiliation searing through her chest, But then something in her snapped. She wasn't going to let them do this to her. Not again. Not here. Not now. "I'm not moving," she said, her voice quiet but firm. The flight attendant stared at her, incredulous, as though she couldn't fathom someone like Maya, defying her. There was a brief silence, a charged stillness that hung in the air between them, before the flight attendant huffed impatiently. "You're causing a scene," she muttered. But Maya didn't care. Let her think whatever she wanted. This wasn't about a seat. This was about the constant, insidious push to remind her she was never enough. She would not give them that satisfaction. The flight attendant left, her heels clicking sharply against the aisle, leaving Maya to her thoughts. The stares from other passengers, though subtle, were unmistakable. She could feel them, the weight of them, the assumption that she wasn't supposed to be here, that her mere presence threatened something they couldn't define but felt compelled to condemn. Maya sank back into her seat, her body tense, her mind racing. The injustice of it all was suffocating. But this wasn't just about this moment. This wasn't just about a first-class seat that she had no right to occupy in their eyes. No, it was about everything. It was about every door that had been closed in her face because of her skin, every job that had slipped through her fingers because of her race, every step she had ever taken that had been judged before she even opened her mouth. Her mind spun with memories of how often she had been told to know her place, of how people who looked like her had always been made to feel small, insignificant, invisible. She had grown up in a world where her value was questioned from the moment she was born, where people who looked like her were rarely seen as worthy of the things that others took for granted: education, opportunity, dignity. But Maya had learned to survive, to find her power in the moments when she was told she had none. And right now, in this moment, she wasn't about to back down. Just then, the plane began its descent, the sudden drop sending her stomach lurching again. The seatbelt light flashed on, and a new voice came over the intercom, announcing their arrival. Maya stared out the window, her eyes glassy, not seeing the clouds parting below them. Her mind wasn't focused on the view, but on what lay ahead. She didn't know how she had gotten herself here, but she could feel it, the heavy, oppressive weight of a system that was designed to break people like her. She was an anomaly on this flight, a reminder of the things they didn't want to see, things they couldn't ignore. The turbulence wasn't just in the air, it was in her heart. And as the plane touched down, she knew one thing for certain: this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something much darker, a game where the rules were rigged from the start, and the stakes were far higher than she could have ever imagined. As the seatbelt sign turned off, the passengers began to stand, gathering their things, preparing to leave the plane. But Maya remained seated, her hands still clutching the armrests, her mind spinning in the chaos of her thoughts. She didn't belong here. She didn't belong anywhere. And yet, she was here, and she wasn't going anywhere. Maya's feet barely touched the cold metal of the jetway as she stepped off the plane, her heart still hammering from the tension of the flight. Her mind felt clouded, as if she had been drifting in a dream for hours, a dream in which every glance, every word, every interaction was another reminder that she was different, that she was lesser, that she didn't belong. She was used to it. She had been living in the margins her whole life. The airport was bustling, just as it had been when she had boarded the plane. But now, the crowd felt different, more pressing, more suffocating. It was like a swarm of invisible eyes was following her, judging her, seeing the imperfections she couldn't hide, the things that made her feel small, insignificant. She wanted to blend into the walls, to disappear in the crowd, but she knew she couldn't. Maya adjusted her bag, pulling it tighter over her shoulder, and quickened her pace, trying to stay ahead of the people in line at baggage claim. She had no baggage to pick up. There was no luxury of checking in a suitcase for her. She had nothing but the clothes on her back and the gnawing sense of unease that followed her everywhere. But before she could get too far, she felt it, two hands grabbing her roughly by the arms. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The harsh grip tightened, and she was spun around to face a security officer, a tall man with a dark uniform and cold eyes. "Miss, we need to speak with you," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any kindness or empathy. His eyes bored into her, and for the first time since she had stepped off the plane, she felt something more than judgment. She felt a real, physical danger. Maya's stomach twisted. She tried to speak, but her words got caught in her throat. The officer cut her off. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Just come with me." His tone was dismissive, as if he was already certain of her guilt, as if he knew she had no right to be in this space. Maya's heart was pounding in her chest, the rush of adrenaline making her dizzy. She had done nothing wrong, nothing at all. But the truth was, none of that mattered to them. To the people who held the power, she was already guilty. They saw her skin, her posture, her hesitation, and they had already decided she was a problem. "I haven't done anything," she whispered, trying to steady her voice, to sound confident, but the words came out weak, defeated. The officer didn't respond. He didn't need to. His expression said it all. Without warning, he shoved her forward, directing her toward a small, isolated room off to the side of the terminal. The fluorescent lights above buzzed, casting a sickly glow that made her skin crawl. Another security guard, a woman, stood by the door, her arms crossed, her eyes scanning Maya with an appraising, critical look, as though Maya's mere presence in this sterile space was an inconvenience. "Get in," the man barked, pushing her through the door and into the cramped room. Maya stumbled but caught herself before hitting the wall. Her mind raced. She needed to think. She needed a way out of this, but everything she did seemed to make things worse. The harder she tried to escape their gaze, the tighter they gripped her, holding her in place like a criminal. The door slammed shut behind her, and she was left standing there, alone, surrounded by the oppressive silence. She wanted to scream, to fight back, to demand answers, but she knew that wouldn't get her anywhere. No one cared about her explanation. No one cared about the truth. Not here. Not in this world. The woman guard took a few steps forward, her face still hard, her gaze unblinking. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice dripping with the kind of mock politeness that always preceded something worse. "Maya," she said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. But the unease in her chest was too strong. She couldn't stop the shaking in her hands. The woman guard didn't respond at first. Instead, she took out a notepad and started writing down her name. But her eyes never left Maya. It was a look of assessment, a look that said she was evaluating Maya, measuring her worth not by her humanity, but by her race. Her very presence here, daring to occupy this space, was a challenge, an affront to the order of things. "You know why you're here, don't you?" the woman asked, leaning in a little closer. The words were accusatory, as if Maya's mere existence was enough to justify this treatment. Maya shook her head. "No, I don't," she said, her voice trembling now. "I haven't done anything." The officer's lips curled into a smile, though there was no humor in it. "Let's see about that." Without warning, the woman guard reached into her pocket and pulled out a small device, pressing it against Maya's wrist. The sound of a scanner beeping filled the room, and Maya's heart skipped a beat. She had heard about the new security protocols, the ones that tracked passengers through facial recognition and biometric data, but this was different. This felt personal, as if they were pulling her apart, piece by piece, trying to uncover something about her that made her unworthy. The woman's smile faded as she read the device, her eyes narrowing. "Seems like you've got a lot of history with this airline," she said, her voice laced with suspicion. "You're one of them, aren't you?" Maya blinked, confused. "One of who?" The woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stepped back, her eyes shifting toward the officer who had escorted Maya in. He stood near the door, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Maya could feel the tension building in the air. Whatever they were about to do, it wasn't going to be good. After a moment, the woman guard spoke again, her voice lowered. "You don't even know, do you? You don't realize what you've done." Maya was about to protest again when the door suddenly opened. Another officer entered, this one dressed in a dark suit, his face hard, his demeanor cold. He didn't say anything at first, just walked toward her with a look of quiet disdain, his eyes scanning her as though she were a problem to be dealt with, not a person. He stopped in front of her, not offering her a seat, not asking her to relax. Instead, he stared down at her, his hands clasped behind his back. "Do you know what you've done?" he asked again, his voice low, as if Maya were somehow responsible for something larger than herself. "I haven't done anything," she repeated, but the words felt hollow in her mouth now. She knew what they wanted. They wanted to break her. They wanted her to crack under the pressure. The man's eyes narrowed, and he glanced briefly at the woman officer, who nodded. He turned back to Maya, his lips curling slightly, as though he had all the answers she was too ignorant to understand. "Let me explain," he said, his voice smooth, almost too calm. "You think you're just a passenger, don't you? Just another woman trying to get by. But you're not. You're a shareholder. You've been funding this airline, whether you know it or not." Maya blinked, stunned. "What are you talking about?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You're one of the silent investors, one of the people who's been putting money into this airline without even realizing it. You have stock in this company. Your money has been funding all of this." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Maya's mind struggled to comprehend them. She had always known she was poor. She had always known that life had stacked the odds against her. But this was something entirely different. Something she could never have anticipated. She stared at the officer, her eyes wide. I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered. "I don't even have money to buy a ticket." The man's gaze hardened. "That's what makes it so beautiful. You've been giving us your money without even knowing it. You've been funding your own humiliation, your own suffering." Maya's breath caught in her throat. The words echoed in her mind, spiraling into confusion and disbelief. She was a part of the system that oppressed her. She was never going to escape. "We'll pause here for a moment. We'd love to hear where you're listening to our stories from, and if you've ever experienced anything similar in your own life. Please share your thoughts in the comments. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Now, let's continue. Maya's hands shook as she sat in the sterile, cold room. Her mind was still spinning from the revelation. A shareholder? A silent investor? It didn't make sense. How could someone like her, someone scraping by from paycheck to paycheck, have been funding the very airline that had treated her like an animal? The pieces didn't fit, and the harder she tried to make sense of it, the more it seemed like a sick joke. The officers around her, those who had been watching her with disdain, didn't offer any explanation. They simply stood there, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. They wanted her to suffer, to feel the weight of the system's cruelty pressing down on her. And she did. The door swung open abruptly, cutting through the tension like a knife. A man in a sharp suit entered, his demeanor cold and methodical. He walked with an air of authority, his eyes scanning her as if she were nothing more than an insect under a microscope. He was tall, with an angular face and sharp features, and he moved with the kind of confidence that suggested he had been in control his entire life. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. "You're Maya, correct?" His voice was smooth, like the voice of someone who had dealt with people like her countless times before. "I'm Mr. Knight, and I'm here to clear this up." Maya swallowed hard, but she didn't respond. She wasn't sure what he meant by "clear this up," but she could feel the storm brewing inside her chest, a whirlwind of confusion and anger that threatened to overtake her at any moment. She had been through enough to know that nothing good came from men like him. "Please sit down," Mr. Knight said, his voice unyielding. Maya didn't move. She couldn't. "Sit down, miss," he repeated, his tone now tinged with irritation. She hesitated, but eventually her body obeyed, her legs weak beneath her. The chair scraped the floor as she sank into it, her hands still trembling in her lap. "You're probably wondering why you're here," Mr. Knight continued, taking a seat across from her. "And you're probably wondering why you, of all people, are involved in this airline's success. Well, let's just say that life has a way of surprising us." Maya wanted to scream, to ask him how he could sit there and speak to her as if this was all just some game, some puzzle that needed solving. Her life wasn't a game. It wasn't a mystery to be solved by a man like him, sitting behind his desk in his pristine suit while she was trapped in this suffocating room. She opened her mouth to speak, but Mr. Knight raised his hand, stopping her. "I know this isn't what you want to hear, but you have to understand something, Maya," he said, his voice taking on a condescending edge. "You, like so many others, are part of a system you don't even understand. You have been contributing to the success of this airline, whether you like it or not. Every dollar you've spent, every penny, has gone into making this airline more powerful, more untouchable, and now you're here, caught in the middle of it." Maya clenched her fists. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask to be part of your system." Mr. Knight's expression didn't change. He didn't seem at all bothered by her outburst. In fact, it seemed to amuse him. "That's exactly what I mean," he said, leaning forward slightly, his eyes gleaming with something dark, something predatory. "You never had to ask. You're part of it simply because of who you are, because of where you come from." Maya recoiled, the sting of his words cutting through her like a knife. It wasn't the first time she had heard something like that. She had heard it all her life, heard people tell her she didn't belong, that she wasn't good enough, that people like her had no place in places like this. But hearing it from someone like Mr. Knight, someone who had the power to destroy her life with a single phone call, made it feel different. It made it feel real. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. "I don't know why you think I'm involved in any of this. I'm just trying to live my life." "You're involved because your ancestors are involved," Mr. Knight said, his voice growing colder with each word. "Your family, your bloodline, has been feeding this system for generations. You're part of the machine, Maya, whether you want to be or not. You were born into it." The words hit her like a slap. It wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who looked like her, everyone who had been systematically oppressed, pushed aside, and told they had no place in the world of power and privilege. "You've been contributing to a system that profits from your pain, from your people's suffering," Mr. Knight continued, his words dripping with venom. "You don't realize it, but you're part of the reason this airline exists, why it thrives, and why people like you, people like me, get to live like this. You've been paying for your own oppression." Maya's blood ran cold. The room seemed to spin around her. Her vision blurred as the weight of his words settled in. She was a pawn, just like everyone else. The game had been rigged from the start, and she hadn't even realized she was playing it. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why now?" Mr. Knight's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Because now you're going to pay for it." Before Maya could react, the door to the room opened again, and 2 more officers stepped in. One of them was the man who had escorted her earlier, the one with the cold eyes. The other was a woman with sharp features, her face expressionless. But the way she looked at Maya told her everything she needed to know. "We're placing you under arrest," the man said, his tone flat, as though he were reading from a script. "For fraud, for operating without a ticket, and for contributing to the financial success of an entity that has knowingly defrauded its passengers." Maya's heart stopped. "What? I haven't done anything wrong. I'm not guilty of anything." But the words fell on deaf ears. The officers didn't care. They had already made up their minds about her. She was guilty because of who she was, and nothing she said could change that. The woman officer moved forward, cuffing Maya's wrists tightly behind her back. The cold metal bit into her skin, but it didn't matter. She was numb. As they led her out of the room, Maya felt a deep, visceral sense of humiliation. The eyes of the officers, the disdain in their voices, it all pointed to one thing. She had never been anything more than a tool for their system, a system that had been built to keep people like her in their place, to remind them that they were always beneath those who had the power to control their fate. "Take her to the holding cells," Mr. Knight ordered, his voice devoid of any emotion. Maya was pushed forward, the cuffs cutting into her flesh as they marched her down the hall. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers. The people in the terminal, all watching her. The looks of judgment, the whispers. She had become the spectacle. But as the door to the holding cell slammed shut behind her, something inside Maya snapped. She was done being passive, done letting people like Mr. Knight tell her what she was worth. She had been pushed too far. She didn't know what was coming next, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going down without a fight. The holding cell was cold, a sterile white space that smelled faintly of disinfectant and sweat. Maya sat on a hard, uncomfortable bench, her hands still cuffed behind her back. She could feel the weight of her situation pressing down on her, suffocating her. Her mind raced, trying to process everything that had happened. The accusations, the contempt, the revelation of her unknowing involvement in a system that had never cared about her. Her skin burned where the cuffs dug into her wrists. The cold metal was a constant reminder that she wasn't free. But the worst part was the silence. The oppressive quiet that filled the cell was worse than any shout, any insult. It was as if she had been erased from the world, reduced to nothing more than a problem to be dealt with. No one spoke to her. No one tried to comfort her. She was just another cog in the machine, expendable and insignificant, minutes stretched into hours. Or maybe it was just the slow, torturous tick of the clock that made it feel that way. Maya had lost track of time. There was no window to the outside world, no way to measure the passage of time other than the occasional footsteps of guards passing by. Every so often, one of them would glance at her, their eyes cold and uninterested, as though they had seen this all before. Then, the door to the cell creaked open, and Maya looked up sharply. A man stepped in, his presence commanding the small room. He was tall, with sharp features, and dressed in a dark suit that seemed to swallow him whole. His face was impassive, his expression unreadable. There was something about him that made her stomach churn. A presence that filled the room with a quiet, dangerous energy. He was the kind of man who didn't need to speak to assert control. His mere existence seemed to demand respect, and Maya could already tell he was the one who had the power to make decisions, the kind of man who had spent his life wielding it, who had the authority to crush people like her with a single word. He walked toward her, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the floor. Maya's heart began to race again. She didn't know who he was, but she had a feeling she wouldn't like the answer. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, the kind of gaze that stripped away any pretense, any illusion of power she might have once had. "You're Maya, aren't you?" he asked, his voice smooth, calculating. He didn't wait for her to answer. He already knew the answer. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. Maya nodded, her throat tight. "Yes." The man smiled, but it wasn't a smile that reached his eyes. "Good, I thought I'd be dealing with someone like you." She didn't respond. She wasn't sure how to. The words caught in her throat. She knew what he was implying. It was the same thing she had heard all her life. People like her, people who looked like her, were always judged first by their appearance. Always seen as less than, always the problem. "You're probably wondering why you're here," he continued, pacing in front of her, like a lion sizing up its prey. "Why we've gone through all this trouble to arrest you, to make sure you understand just how deep you are in this mess. You think you're some innocent bystander, don't you? Some victim of circumstance." He stopped in front of her, his eyes narrowing. "But that's not the case, Maya. You're part of the problem. You've always been part of the problem." Maya tried to speak, but the words felt like they were stuck in her chest. She wanted to tell him that she hadn't asked for this, that she hadn't known anything about the stocks, or the company, or any of it. But it didn't matter. She already knew that no one would believe her. They never did. The man leaned closer, his face only inches from hers now. She could feel his breath, cold and unrelenting, against her skin. "You don't understand, do you?" he murmured. "You're not just here because of some random mistake. You're here because your people, your kind, have been feeding the system for generations. You've been paying for your own subjugation. Every dollar, every cent you've ever spent. It's all been used to prop up a system that keeps you beneath people like me. You think you can escape it? You think you're different? You're not. You're just another cog in the machine." Maya's fists clenched at her sides, her jaw tightening. She wanted to lash out. She wanted to scream at him, tell him how wrong he was. But she knew it wouldn't matter. He didn't care about her story. To him, she was nothing more than a tool, a piece of property. And the worst part was that he wasn't wrong. Not entirely. She had been a part of that system, whether she liked it or not. And now she was paying for it. The man straightened up, taking a step back as if he were done with the confrontation. He didn't need to break her. He knew he already had. All it took was a few words, a few reminders of how little she meant in the grand scheme of things. "Let me make something very clear, Maya," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous level. "You are nothing. You always have been, and you always will be. You will never have the power to change anything. You will never be more than what we allow you to be. And as far as I'm concerned, you are a liability, a problem that needs to be dealt with." He turned toward the door, pausing for a moment before he left. "Enjoy your time here, Maya. It won't be long before you realize just how powerless you truly are." The door slammed shut behind him, and the sound echoed in the empty room. Maya sat in silence, her heart thudding in her chest, her mind reeling from the weight of his words. She wanted to cry, wanted to scream, but she didn't. She had no strength left for tears. The darkness in her chest felt like it was swallowing her whole. But she wasn't going to give up. She couldn't. Not now. She wasn't powerless. She had spent her life fighting for respect, fighting for dignity, fighting for the right to be seen. She wasn't going to let people like him strip that away from her. She wasn't going to let them win. Maya wasn't going to bow down to the system that had been built to oppress her. She was going to tear it down, piece by piece, and she was going to start by finding out the truth. Everything. About the airline. About her role in it. About the people who had used her and people like her as pawns in their game of control. The path ahead wasn't going to be easy. In fact, it was going to be harder than anything she had ever faced. But she would find a way. She had no choice. The storm inside her was just beginning. Maya woke up to the sound of metal scraping against metal, the sound of the cell door opening. The harsh fluorescent light above flickered, casting long, unnerving shadows across the small room. Her body ached from the uncomfortable position she had been forced into all night, the hard bench cutting into her back. She hadn't slept much, and when she did, her dreams had been filled with the images of the cold-faced officers and the sneering man in the dark suit. His words still echoed in her ears, a constant reminder that she was nothing more than a pawn in a system designed to oppress her. The door swung open, and the same officer from before stepped into the room, his expression unreadable. He didn't acknowledge her as he moved to the far corner of the room, rummaging through some papers. Maya's stomach tightened as she stood up, her legs stiff from the hours spent sitting. "Move," the officer said flatly, not even glancing at her. Maya hesitated for a moment. She didn't know where he was taking her, but she had no choice. She didn't have the luxury of making decisions anymore. She had been reduced to a prisoner of a system that cared nothing for her or her innocence. The officer didn't wait for her to make up her mind. He grabbed her arm roughly and yanked her toward the door. She stumbled, trying to keep her balance as the officer led her down a narrow corridor. The walls were bare and white, the sterile environment making her feel more like a specimen in a laboratory than a human being. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic, and the distant sounds of people talking in hushed voices only added to the feeling that she was being buried alive. The officer led her through a series of security doors, down winding hallways that felt like they were designed to trap her. Maya could feel the weight of each step she took. The silence that enveloped them was almost suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in on her. She tried to focus, to find some semblance of control in the chaos of her mind, but the thought of what lay ahead made her feel powerless. They arrived at a small, cold room. It was almost identical to the holding cell, except this one had a single desk in the middle and a chair placed on either side. Behind the desk, a woman in a navy blue uniform sat, her face stone cold, her eyes never meeting Maya's. The officer gave her a shove toward the chair and left without a word, leaving Maya standing there, her heart pounding in her chest. The woman behind the desk didn't acknowledge her. She simply pulled a file in front of her and began to flip through the pages. The silence between them stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. Maya's pulse quickened as she waited for the woman to speak, to explain why she was being dragged from one room to another, why her life had been turned upside down. Finally, the woman spoke. Her voice was cold, clinical, like she was reading from a script. "You've been accused of fraud," she said, her eyes flicking up briefly to look at Maya. "Flying without a ticket. But you're not just anyone. You're more than that. You're a shareholder in the airline." Maya blinked, confusion flooding her mind. "I don't understand. I never bought any stocks. I don't have that kind of money." The woman's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't kind. "You don't need money to be a shareholder. The airline's stock has been distributed in ways you probably haven't even realized. Through your ancestors, through your bloodline." Maya felt the blood drain from her face. What? The woman flipped through the file again, her eyes scanning the pages with a practiced efficiency. "It's all here. Your family has been contributing to this airline for generations. Whether you knew it or not, you've been funding it. You've been funding your own humiliation." Maya felt her knees go weak. The world seemed to spin around her as the woman's words sank in. Her entire life, her struggle to survive, had been a part of this system. She had been feeding the very forces that kept people like her oppressed. Her bloodline, her ancestry, everything that had been passed down through generations, was tied to the very people who sought to destroy her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. What could she say? What could she possibly say that would make this make sense? The woman behind the desk didn't wait for her to respond. "You've been paying for your own suffering, Maya," she continued, her voice devoid of any emotion. "Every time you buy a ticket, every time you contribute to the economy, you're feeding the system. And now you're here, being held accountable for the very thing you've helped build." Maya shook her head, the weight of the words pressing down on her like a crushing tide. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't know. How could I have known?" The woman's expression remained impassive. "It doesn't matter. The system doesn't care if you know. It doesn't care if you understand. You're part of it, and now you have to pay the price." Tears welled up in Maya's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She couldn't. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She had spent her entire life fighting against the forces that sought to crush her, and she wasn't about to let them win now. The woman behind the desk leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto Maya's with an unsettling intensity. "You've been accused of defrauding this airline, of using your position to manipulate the system. You've been charged with flying without a ticket, even though you've been funding the airline through your investments. Do you understand the gravity of the situation?" Maya's throat tightened as she fought to keep her composure. I didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know." The woman sighed as if Maya's words were an annoyance. "Ignorance is not an excuse. The law doesn't care if you knew or not. You've been a part of this system your entire life. You've been complicit." "Complicit?" Maya repeated, her voice shaking. "I didn't ask for any of this. I'm just trying to live." The woman leaned back in her chair, her gaze never leaving Maya's face. "Trying to live? Is that what you call it? You've been contributing to your own subjugation. You've been feeding the system that oppresses you, and now you think you can escape the consequences." Maya's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Please, I didn't know," she pleaded. "I didn't want this. I never asked for any of it." But the woman's face remained unchanged, her voice as cold and indifferent as ever. "It doesn't matter what you wanted. You're a part of this world now, whether you like it or not, and the consequences will follow." Maya's world collapsed around her. The truth was a heavy, suffocating weight that she couldn't escape. Everything she had believed about her life, about who she was and what she stood for, was shattered in that moment. She was nothing more than a pawn in a game she had never understood, a game where people like her were always meant to lose. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she wiped them away angrily, refusing to give in to the overwhelming sense of despair that threatened to consume her. She wasn't done. She wouldn't be. The woman behind the desk stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "You'll be transferred to a holding facility soon. You'll have a chance to explain yourself to the higher-ups, but don't get your hopes up. They've already decided what will happen to you. You're too much of a liability." Maya stood up, her fists clenched at her sides. "I'm not a liability," she said, her voice shaky but filled with determination. "I'm not your pawn, and I'm not going to let you or anyone else decide my fate." The woman smirked, but there was no warmth in it. "We'll see about that." She turned and walked toward the door, leaving Maya standing there, her mind racing with a mixture of rage, confusion, and fear. But one thing was certain, this wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. The cold light of the holding facility was more intense than ever, washing over everything in the small, claustrophobic room. Maya sat on the edge of a bench, her back against the unforgiving concrete wall. The room smelled faintly of mildew and stale air, a place where people were forgotten, ignored, and erased from the world outside. It felt like a tomb, cold, sterile, and lifeless. She had been here for hours now, though she wasn't sure how much time had passed. Her thoughts swirled with a mixture of confusion, anger, and despair. The accusations against her had only grown more absurd the longer she sat there. Fraud. Defrauding the airline by flying without a ticket. Contributing to a system she didn't even understand. But what was worse than any of those charges was the reality that had begun to settle in her mind. Maya had always known that the world wasn't fair, that the rules were rigged against her. She had grown up watching her family struggle, watching her community fight just to survive in a system that had no intention of letting them succeed. But this felt different. This wasn't just about survival. This was about being ground into the dirt, about having everything she had ever known turned against her. The door to the room creaked open, and Maya immediately straightened up, instinctively bracing herself. She wasn't sure who it would be this time, the officers, the same cold-faced woman who had questioned her earlier, or someone else entirely. It didn't matter anymore. Whoever it was, she was ready for it. But when the figure entered, it was not someone she recognized. The man was tall and well-dressed, his black suit perfectly tailored to his frame. He carried himself with an air of confidence that Maya immediately recognized as the kind of power that came from wealth and privilege. His skin was pale, his hair dark, and his eyes cold, calculating. He didn't acknowledge Maya at first. Instead, he moved to the desk in the corner of the room, flipping through a folder filled with papers. The man was so immersed in his task that for a moment, Maya wondered if he had even noticed her at all. But then, he looked up, his gaze settling on her with the weight of 1,000 judgments. "Miss," he said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth, as though he had practiced this moment 1,000 times before. "I'm sorry to keep you waiting. My name is Mr. Hargrove. I represent the airline in this matter, and I think it's time we had a little chat." Maya didn't respond immediately. There was no point in speaking. She already knew what he was going to say, knew that it would be just another lecture about how insignificant she was in the grand scheme of things. The system had already decided her fate. She was a cog in a machine, nothing more. He crossed the room slowly, each step deliberate. Maya watched him with a mix of wariness and disdain, but she refused to let him see how much his presence affected her. She had faced worse than this. She had fought for her place in a world that had tried to push her down for her entire life. A man like him wouldn't be the one to break her. Mr. Hargrove finally stopped in front of her, his cold eyes scanning her as if she were a bug under a microscope. There was no warmth in his gaze, no sympathy. It was as if he could already see the end of this story, and he wasn't even concerned with the details. "You're probably wondering why you're here," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. "Why we've gone to such lengths to bring you in. You don't really understand, do you? You've been feeding a system that's been built on people like you. People who are born into nothing, raised in a world that tells them they're worthless, and yet they continue to feed it. They contribute without even knowing it. You've been a part of this, and now we need to correct it. Maya felt her heart race as she tried to process his words. She had been called many things in her life, but never this. To him, she was nothing but a tool, something to be used, something to be corrected. I don't understand what you mean, she said, her voice low but firm. She wasn't going to back down, not now. He smirked, clearly entertained by her confusion. Of course you don't, but you will. He took a step back and gestured for her to stand. Maya hesitated, but then she stood up slowly, her body aching with the movement. She couldn't help the tremor in her hands, but she hid it as best as she could. Let me show you something, he said, his voice still smooth, as if they were in a meeting instead of a prison-like room. You see, we didn't bring you here just to make an example of you. No, you're much more important than that. You're a symbol, miss, a symbol of everything that's wrong with people like you. People who think they can play the game, who think they can rise above their station. He reached into the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper, holding it up for her to see. It was a stock certificate, one that had her name on it. Maya's stomach lurched. You didn't know, did you? He continued, his voice sickly sweet. That you've been an investor in this company for years. That your bloodline has been a source of profit for people like me. You've been paying for your own oppression without even realizing it. Her throat tightened. She had no idea what he was talking about. This wasn't her doing. She didn't ask for this. She didn't ask to be tied to this corrupt, disgusting system. But the more he spoke, the more she realized that her very existence had been used against her. Her heritage, her family's struggles, had all been manipulated to keep people like her down. This stock, he continued, was transferred to you long ago. Your family's legacy is tied to ours. Every flight you've ever taken, every dollar you've spent, has funded the system that keeps people like you oppressed. You're part of it. You've always been part of it. Maya's mind spun. She tried to make sense of what he was saying, but nothing about it felt real. How could she be part of this? How could she have been complicit in something so vile? She wasn't even aware of any of this. How could they hold her accountable for something that had been done without her knowledge? Her hands clenched into fists as she fought to hold back the tears. But there was something inside her, a fire that burned with the realization that she couldn't let this stand. She couldn't let him get away with this. I never wanted this, Maya spat, her voice shaking with fury. You think you can use me like this? Like I'm just some tool to prop up your empire, but I'm not. I'm not your puppet. Mr. Hargrove's smirk faded slightly, and for the first time, he looked almost surprised. You really don't get it, do you? You never had a choice. None of you do. People like you, people who think they can rise above, who think they can change the rules, they'll always be brought back down. And we'll always win. Because we built this system, and you, no matter how hard you try, are just a cog in the wheel. Maya stood up straighter, despite the fear that threatened to overtake her. She wasn't a cog. She was a person, and no matter how hard they tried to break her, they wouldn't succeed. I'm not afraid of you, she said, her voice steady now. And I'm not afraid of your system. I'll fight back. You can try to control me, try to use me, but I'm not your victim. Mr. Hargrove's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Maya thought she saw a flicker of something, resentment maybe, beneath his calm facade. But he quickly recovered, his smile returning, though it was even colder than before. Good luck, miss, he said, turning to leave. You're going to need it. As he walked out, Maya stood there, her heart pounding in her chest. She was no longer just a passive observer in her own life. They had pushed her to the brink, but she wasn't going to let them destroy her. She would fight. She would find a way to tear down the walls they had built around her. The storm was coming. Maya stood at the edge of the small holding cell, her fingers brushing lightly against the cold, unforgiving wall. It was all she could do to keep herself grounded. The weight of everything that had happened since she had been brought in here, the accusations, the humiliation, the crushing reality of the system she had never truly understood, pressed heavily on her chest. But worse than the fear of her situation was the knowledge that the very system she had always fought against, the one that had stifled her existence for as long as she could remember, had finally come for her. They had broken her once already. They had crushed her spirit with their accusations, their assumptions, and their carefully crafted lies. And yet, she stood here, her fists clenched at her sides, refusing to let them take any more from her. She was alone now, trapped in this cold, sterile room that seemed to echo with the sounds of her own heartbeat, the walls closing in on her. She had lost track of the hours. Time had become irrelevant in this place. All that mattered now was what would come next. Her thoughts drifted back to the man, Mr. Hargrove. The smug, self-assured smile that had never once faltered, the way he had spoken to her as though she were nothing more than an inconvenience to be dealt with. He had made it clear that she was nothing in their eyes, just another pawn in a game too large for her to understand. His words had sliced through her like a knife, reminding her of everything she had spent her life trying to overcome. "You've always been part of it," he had said. "You'll always be a cog in the machine." The words haunted her now. They clawed at her, gnawing at her insides as if they were meant to become her reality. But she wouldn't let it be. She couldn't. She had fought too hard for too long to let them win. Her family's legacy, her bloodline, had been twisted and used against her, a weapon to control her. The very thing that had kept her struggling in the margins of society had now become her prison. It didn't matter that she had never asked for any of this. She was still held responsible. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized something. They were wrong. She wasn't a cog in anyone's machine. She was a person with a voice, with power, with the ability to change the course of this. And no matter how hard they tried to bury her under their weight, she would find a way to fight back. The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts. A door opened somewhere down the hall, and she stiffened, preparing herself for the next round of questions or accusations. The world outside these walls had become a distant, blurry thing, something she couldn't quite touch, but the reality of the situation was very much present. She could feel it pressing down on her, suffocating her with each breath. The door to her cell opened, and the officer from earlier stepped inside. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her presence in any meaningful way. His eyes were fixed on the floor as he made his way to the desk in the corner of the room. Maya stood up, but she didn't approach. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing her in a submissive position. She had learned long ago that submission was a tool used to control, to break the spirit of people like her. "Get up," the officer finally muttered, his voice flat and emotionless. "They're ready to see you." Maya didn't say anything in response. She simply stood, walking slowly toward the door, her mind racing with the possibilities of what would happen next. She had already been stripped of her dignity once. There was no telling what they would do to her now, but she had no choice. She had no choice but to face whatever came next. The officer led her down the long, sterile hallways again, his hand gripping her arm with an almost unnecessary force, as if he could somehow strip her of her last shred of defiance with each step. The air was thick with tension, the silence between them oppressive. Maya could hear the faint murmur of voices somewhere far ahead, but the words were indistinct, lost in the vacuum of this cold, forgotten place. They arrived at a large door, and the officer knocked twice before opening it. He didn't wait for her to enter. He simply shoved her forward, and Maya stumbled, her heart racing. Inside, the room was stark, almost clinically so, with a long table that sat at the center, surrounded by several people in suits. These were the faces of power, people who didn't need to speak to assert their authority, because their very presence was a reminder of how small and insignificant she was. Mr. Hargrove was there, sitting at the head of the table, his gaze cold and calculating as it swept over her. Beside him were two other men, older, their faces hard and set in the grim expression of those who had long since ceased to care about the human cost of their decisions. Maya could feel their eyes on her as she stood in the doorway, their gazes heavy and dismissive. To them, she was nothing but a problem to be dealt with, an obstacle in the path of their empire. She could feel their contempt, their judgment, as if her very presence was an affront to their carefully constructed world. "Sit," Mr. Hargrove ordered, his voice as cold as it had been the day he first spoke to her. His hand gestured toward the empty seat at the far end of the table. Maya hesitated, but then walked to the seat, sitting down with her back straight, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She refused to let them see how much they had affected her. "You're here," Mr. Hargrove began, his voice smooth and steady, "because you've been accused of defrauding this company, of using your position as a shareholder to manipulate the system. Do you understand the severity of these charges?" Maya stared at him, her eyes unblinking. "I don't understand why I'm being accused of anything at all," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. "I never asked to be part of your system. I never knew about the stocks. I never knew." One of the older men beside Hargrove, who hadn't yet spoken, leaned forward slightly, his sharp gaze fixed on her with a disinterested kind of disdain. "Your ignorance is irrelevant," he said, his voice low and dismissive. "You're part of something much larger than yourself. Your existence, your bloodline, has been feeding the power structure for years, and now you expect us to believe that you didn't know." Maya felt a surge of anger rise in her chest, but she swallowed it down. "I didn't know," she repeated, her voice shaking now, but only slightly. "I'm not responsible for something I didn't even know existed." Hargrove's eyes narrowed, and for a moment there was an unsettling silence. "We're not here to argue about what you knew or didn't know," he said finally. "We're here because we need to make sure this doesn't get out of hand. People like you, people from your background, think they can rise above their station, but you can't. You'll never be able to." Maya's chest tightened as his words struck her like a blow. It was the same story, over and over again. People like her would never make it. People like her were meant to stay in their place, to serve those who had been born into privilege, born into power. And every attempt to rise above their station was met with punishment, with humiliation. But Maya refused to let them win. "You're wrong," she said, her voice trembling but full of conviction. "You can't control me. You can't break me." Hargrove's face twisted into a smile, but it was a smile of contempt, of superiority. "We'll see about that," he said. "We'll see just how far you're willing to go to fight back." As the words hung in the air, the weight of the moment settled over Maya. She was at a crossroads now, and there was no turning back. They could try to break her, they could try to control her, but one thing was certain: they hadn't broken her spirit yet, and they never would. The battle wasn't over. Maya sat still in the chair, her hands resting on her lap, eyes fixed forward, but her mind was a whirlwind. The cold, sterile room felt more like a tomb than a meeting space, and the people surrounding her, sitting with the air of inevitability, were no different than vultures circling their prey. Their eyes were trained on her as if she were a thing, not a person, a problem to be solved, not a human being deserving of empathy or justice. She could hear the rhythmic beat of her heart in her ears, each pulse loud, a constant reminder of the deep-seated fear that threatened to take over. But she wouldn't let it. She couldn't. They had brought her here, but they hadn't broken her. Not yet. Mr. Hargrove leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together as he studied her, his eyes glinting with cold calculation. The other men around the table, those faceless, indifferent figures who had been so quick to dismiss her, had begun to lean back as well, their expressions bored, expectant, waiting for her to fold, for her to break under the pressure. It was as if this was all just a formality, as if they had already decided what would happen to her. "You know why you're here," Mr. Hargrove finally spoke, his voice smooth, deliberate, carrying an edge that seemed to slice through the already tense air. "You've been accused of fraud, of misusing your position as a shareholder in this company. But more than that, you've been feeding into a system that has systematically kept people like you in the dirt. And now you expect us to believe that you had no idea." Maya's fists clenched under the table. Her body stiffened, but she kept her gaze steady, her chin held high. She could feel the sting of his words as they tore into her, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her falter. "I told you," Maya replied, her voice quiet but firm. "I didn't know. I didn't ask for any of this. I don't want to be part of your corrupt system. I'm not your tool." The room grew quiet. She could feel their eyes upon her, their contempt radiating in waves. One of the older men, someone she hadn't yet seen speak, shifted in his chair, eyes narrowed as he observed her. "You have to understand something, miss," he said, his voice low and dripping with superiority. "You are exactly the kind of person who perpetuates the system we have in place. You, people like you, think you're different. You think you can rise above your circumstances, but no one gets out. You think you can break free from the cycle, but you can't. People like you are destined to be trapped. You were born to serve, not to lead. That's just how it is." Maya recoiled at the venom in his voice, at the casual cruelty with which he delivered his words. His face was expressionless, but his eyes held something darker, something colder, as if he had never even considered the possibility that people like her might deserve better, that she might deserve better. But Maya refused to let his words get to her. She had heard it all before. People like him had always looked at people like her and decided that she was nothing more than a tool for their success, that her life was meant to serve their agendas, their goals, but she wouldn't let him control her. "I didn't choose this," Maya said, her voice rising now, a hint of frustration breaking through the calm she had fought so hard to maintain. "I didn't choose to be part of your system. I didn't ask to be a part of this world. But you don't get to tell me that I'm stuck in it forever. You don't get to decide my worth. I'm not your servant." There was a pause, and the air in the room seemed to thicken, the tension palpable. Mr. Hargrove's lips curled into a thin, cruel smile. "Oh, but you already are," he said, his voice a snake's hiss, "whether you accept it or not. You've been serving this system for years without even realizing it. The money you've spent, the actions you've taken, all of it has contributed to the success of this company. The way you've played the game, all of it has fed the very beast that keeps people like you down. And now you want to pretend that you're above it. You can't. People like you never rise above." Her breath caught in her throat, the weight of his words crashing down on her. The realization hit harder than she expected. She had spent her entire life trying to fight against the odds, to climb out of the place she was born into. But it felt as if the very foundation of her existence had been tied to the machine that sought to crush her. Her own bloodline, her heritage, everything that had shaped her had somehow been used against her. It was as though her every move had been calculated to feed into a system that saw her as nothing more than a means to an end. But she refused to let it break her. She couldn't. "No," she whispered, though the words were louder than she intended. "No, I won't let you do this. I won't be part of your game anymore." Mr. Hargrove's smile deepened, as though he were savoring the moment. "You don't have a choice. You're part of the system now, Maya, and once you're in, there's no escaping." His words felt like chains wrapping around her, tightening with every breath she took. But there was something in her, something deep inside her, that refused to let it end this way. She wasn't a cog. She wasn't a tool. She was a person, and she would fight for her right to be seen as one. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of their collective gaze pressing down on her, suffocating her. The older man continued to stare at her with that same look of disdain, his eyes colder than ice. Maya could feel the heat of her own anger rising within her, the fire of determination that she had carried with her entire life, the fire that refused to let them win. Without warning, she stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. The motion startled them, but she didn't care. She wasn't going to let them control her anymore. "You think you can break me," Maya said, her voice shaking, but strong. "You think you can just tell me who I am and what I'm worth. But I'm not your prisoner. I'm not your pawn. And I will not let you destroy me." Mr. Hargrove's face tightened, his eyes narrowing as he stood, his chair screeching behind him. "You don't get it, do you?" he spat, his voice low and threatening. You never had control in the first place. You never had power. You were never anything more than a small part of something bigger than you, something that controls you, manipulates you. I'm not controlled, Maya shot back, her voice rising with more certainty. I'm not your slave. You don't get to decide who I am. You don't get to decide what I become. The room fell into a heavy silence. Mr. Hargrove's expression faltered for just a moment, his smirk slipping. The older man beside him exchanged a glance with the other two, but neither of them spoke. The entire room seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Maya stood her ground, her body shaking from the intensity of the moment, but her voice remained steady. I'm done letting people like you dictate my life. I will find a way out of this. You can't control me. For a moment, it seemed like the world held its breath. And then, with a flash of realization, Maya knew something fundamental had changed. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. There were others like her. Others who had been overlooked, ignored, and treated as less than human. Together they would rise. Together, they would tear down the system that had oppressed them for so long. And with that thought, a new fire ignited within her. It burned brighter than it ever had before, a fire that would never be extinguished. Mr. Hargrove finally spoke again, his voice low, his tone threatening. You think this is over, don't you? He said. You're wrong. You have no idea what's coming for you. But Maya just smiled, her resolve solidifying. I don't need to know, she replied, her voice calm but filled with strength. I'm not afraid of you. And with that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving them behind. The storm was just beginning. Maya walked through the long, sterile hallways, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the silence. Her body was exhausted, every muscle aching from the strain of everything she had been through in the past days. The sharp edges of humiliation, the weight of their words, still clung to her like a second skin. But her mind was clearer now, more focused than it had ever been. She had walked into this place a prisoner, both physically and mentally, thinking she was powerless, thinking that the system had already won. But now, with each step she took, she could feel the chains loosening. They hadn't broken her, they hadn't destroyed her, and they never would. Her mind was racing as she replayed the moments of the past few days. Mr. Hargrove's cold smile, the sneering, dismissive remarks from the older men at the table, the accusations, the shame. Everything had been meant to break her, to make her question her worth, to convince her that she had no place in a world that had never cared about people like her. But she knew better now. They had underestimated her. They thought that because she had been born into this world of oppression, she would accept it. They thought they could control her. But Maya wasn't their pawn. Not anymore. As she made her way through the halls, her heart pounded. She knew this was the moment. This was the moment she would decide what came next, where she went from here. She could either fall into the trap they had set for her, or she could rise above it. And she wasn't going to let them win. She had heard their words. People like you never rise above. They had laughed in her face, dismissed her like a nuisance, like an inconvenience they could easily discard. But Maya had learned something they didn't understand. Strength doesn't come from what's been handed to you. Strength comes from what you decide to fight for. She passed the guards, their eyes following her as she walked, but she didn't look back. She wouldn't let them see her fear. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her broken. As she neared the exit, the weight of everything that had happened seemed to fall off her shoulders. She stepped outside, and the cool breeze hit her face, the sounds of the city filling the air. For the first time in days, she felt a sense of freedom. She was no longer trapped in the world they had created for her. She had stepped out of their system, their rules, and now the world was hers to reclaim. But that freedom came with a price. Maya looked around, taking in the busy street, the people walking by, the world continuing on as if nothing had happened. They had all continued, as they always did. For them, her fight, her struggle, was just another story that would be forgotten by the time they stepped inside their homes, away from the chaos of the world. But Maya wasn't like them. She couldn't forget. She couldn't forget the way she had been treated, the way she had been humiliated, degraded. She couldn't forget the people who had tried to erase her, who had tried to crush her spirit beneath their feet. They didn't know what it was like to grow up like she had, fighting for every scrap of dignity, every inch of respect, to be constantly reminded that people like her were never meant to rise above their station. But Maya had risen, and she was only just beginning. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, interrupting her thoughts. She pulled it out, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the name on the screen. Jasmine. She answered quickly, her voice shaky but filled with relief. Jasmine, is everything okay? I don't know, Maya. I've been trying to reach you, the words getting out, what they did to you, what they tried to do. Jasmine's voice crackled on the other end, filled with concern. Are you okay? I'm fine, Maya said, though her voice felt like a lie. Her mind was still reeling from everything that had happened, but she had to keep going. I'm free. They can't control me anymore. Jasmine was quiet for a moment. I'm so proud of you, Maya. You know that, right? What you're doing, standing up to them, you're not just doing it for yourself. You're doing it for all of us. Maya closed her eyes for a moment, letting Jasmine's words sink in. She had always fought alone, always carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, thinking she had to do it by herself. But now, hearing Jasmine's words, she realized something important. She wasn't alone, not anymore. They tried to break me, Maya said, her voice steady now. But they failed. They can't win. Not if we fight back. Not if we all fight back. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been told they were less than. She was fighting for every person who had ever been told their worth was defined by their skin, their background, their family, their circumstances. She was fighting for a future where people like her didn't have to ask for respect. They demanded it. Maya turned her gaze to the horizon. The future was uncertain. The world still a harsh place. But she could see the faintest hint of a new dawn breaking on the horizon. A future where the systems of control, of oppression, were shattered. A future where people who had been told they didn't matter would rise up and take what was theirs. There would be no more apologies, no more excuses, no more pretending. It was time for change, and Maya was going to make sure it happened. As she stepped into the world, her heart swelling with determination, she felt something shift inside her. A fire had been ignited that no one would be able to extinguish. They had tried to break her. They had tried to silence her. But all they had done was awaken something greater. The fight was just beginning, and this time, it was her turn to lead. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. What did you think of Maya's journey and the challenges she faced? Have you ever experienced racism or felt oppressed in your life? Your comments mean a lot to us, and we truly value each one of you for being a part of this community. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life. Wishing you all a great day ahead. Also, drop a comment with the phrase, "The fight never ends," so we know you've listened until the very end.